Hi, I am Tom Needham, and on this episode of Sounds, we explore Man from Pretentia, a documentary capturing the life and legacy of legendary New York gallerist Paul Bridgewater. Directed by Chih-Hsuan Liang and produced by Steve Zehentner, the film chronicles Bridgewater's rise in the East Village art scene, his struggles to sustain his gallery, and his unwavering dedication to emerging artists. Through intimate scenes, Man from Pretentia presents a study of Bridgewater's passion, resilience, and the lasting impact he had on the art world. Chi, Steve, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you,
Wonderful, Tom.
Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
I should mention that this film is a featured selection at the 2025 Port Jefferson documentary film series, which they will be attending. But I am very interested in hearing from the two of you what initially drew you to Paul Bridgewater's um, story and to make a film out of this.
Chi, should I start with the Lower East Side biography project a little bit?
I think so. If you do that, and then I'll tell the story how I met you.
Right, right. So, yeah, she came into the project because with another producer and my theater partner, Penny Arcade, since 1999, we've been producing a video oral history project called the Lower East Side Biography Project. And that project really, I mean, Penny Arcade came to the Lower East Side in 1967. She was a teenager in a world of people who were in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and who knew the artist of the generation from the 20s and 30s. And her orientation has always been like soaking it up and holding the history. And in the 80s and the 90s, I mean, the devastation of the AIDS crisis combined with the gentrification of the Lower East Side, we both started to agitate and started to document in a casual way um, the stories of the individuals that were important foundationally for that neighborhood in terms of the arts and politics. And in 1999, we formalized through public access television the Lower East Side Biography Project. So we make 28-minute biographies. We've done people like Taylor Mead, Judith Molina from the Living Theater, John Journo, William Burroughs' friend and poet, um, Tom O'Horigan, like dozens and dozens of really important people. And Paul Bridgewater was on our list from the very beginning um, to do, we usually do like 2 3 hour interviews that are then part of the archive and part of the source material that are then crafted into these biographies that play on public television. So um, Paul was on our list and we were poised to do our first interview with him. Penny had known Paul for a long time. And Penny Arcade and I, we primarily do theater, and we were performing at Joe's Pub, and I think that's the first time Chi came into the picture. So Chi, you could pick it up from there.
Hmm.
Sure. That was my second year in New York, and I was in a boutique shop in Soho, and the store owner started talking to me, and she asked me what I do, and I told her I'm a film editor. And she said, "Oh, great. Then I have to introduce you to my friend Penny Arcade because Penny is always looking for editors."
Hmm.
I was a little confused because she did not ask for my resume or nothing, but I thought she was getting me a job. So, so I met with Penny and I learned about the Lower East Side Biography Project. Penny took me to Steve, and Steve told me about the project and told me that they need volunteer editors. So I volunteered. And Steve told me they've interviewed, at the time, they probably have 30 something interviews they haven't edited. And I picked Paul.
Hmm. So you picked Paul, and Can you just explain one more time? Is this public access in New York City, or is this like PBS?
I know public access. Yeah, MNN in Manhattan.
Okay.
They
Yeah.
were they were the initial funders. They funded us, a little bit for 5 years, but that was the foundational funding that really built the structure for the project. And the, the project really was hinged upon bringing in young filmmakers to interact with the older, established artistic residents of the neighborhood to create like a multi-generational dialogue. So the young filmmakers would come in and we would produce the main interview, but then they would shepherd the project and craft the 28-minute biography that was our obligation for the funding. And they had tremendous amount of freedom. So each biography is, stylistically very different, based upon the editing style and the preferences of the younger filmmaker. And she was just coming in to do something like that, and she took it into an entirely much expanded and beautiful direction with Paul.
So, at what point did you realize maybe we have a feature length documentary here?
The beginning was, I was not thinking. So Paul had a gallery at the Lower East Side at the time called Smart Clothes Gallery. I thought if I want to work on, it used to be an oral history kind of style of documentary. I thought I should meet with this guy and decide if I want to work on this film. So I walked into his gallery one day without telling anybody. And as you see in the film, Paul was as welcoming as he is. I was thrilled because I was wearing my jeans and sneakers and I didn't think anybody would pay attention. But he said, "Oh, let me give you a tour." And he spent the next 20, 30 minutes to tell me about the stories of the artworks and artists and ask about me. And by the end of that tour, I said, "I think I'm going to make a documentary about you."
Wow, that's incredible. There's so much to discuss, but before we really get into the film and some of the ideas in the movie, could one of you just give us like a little summary of who he is, just so they have a reference if they're not familiar with who he is?
Steve, I think you can do a better job.
I don't know. Gee, you really got to know Paul so well. In general, Paul, when New York really represented, Manhattan really represented a sanctuary for young kids who were either cast out of their families or identities weren't supported. Paul represented someone who left home, which was in a trailer park in California in the 70s, after kind of a traumatic incident with his father who really betrayed him, hitchhiked across the country and started to find his place almost immediately in New York City. New York City is that New York City of then. I mean, hopefully still maintain some of this, but New York City welcomes everyone from all around the world. And so Paul came in the 70s and started to establish himself in the art world as an artist. And by, I guess it was 1983, had his first gallery in the East Village. And the East Village art scene was starting to explode at that time. Um, the Soho art scene was the established art scene, and the East Village was, the anarchistic progressive side of the Greenwich Village. And it had just kind of been decimated in the 70s. And so there was a lot of open real estate, a lot of spaces were being reclaimed. And that was kind of the driver for cheaper housing, artists moving in, galleries being established. And Paul established right away in that scene, and continued to be involved in the art world. But this film really kind of does pick up. I guess it was 2013, Chi, when he started Smart Clothes.
2012.
2012. So um, he was, he was a downtown uh, character. He's one of those. He had, I mean, the title of the film, Man for Pretentia, really is a play on the fact that he had this affected accent that sounded something British, something royal from somewhere else, but where he was actually a boy from California, from very modest roots, and there was nothing pretentious about the guy. But he loved art, he loved artists, he loved supporting artists, and I can leave it at that for now.
I love everything about this movie. I've always been sort of mystified by the art world, and this film, more so than any other movie I think I've ever seen on the subject, really explains things, and particularly through his story. I mean, I love all the stuff in the movie dealing with economics. I think one thing that's very much made clear in this film is that New York City used to be quite a different place, and maybe we could start with that. Um, how years ago, people could have a gallery, people could be artists, people could be musicians, um, and they didn't have to have a lot of money. In fact, New York City attracted a lot of artists because of the fact that it was a place that you can make a go of it and not have a lot of money. And so this whole scene developed, but over the years that has changed a great deal. Can you guys explain that a little bit to our listeners? How such a magical place that really just was the launching pad for so many artists couldn't have happened if it wasn't for the financial aspects of what New York City used to be and why that's becoming tougher and tougher.
I can tell anecdote stories. Maybe Steve can tell the story from a bigger point of view, a larger point of view.
Yeah,
I've met many artists through making of this film. Many of them has lived in the East Village since the 70s. Like in the film, the art dealer Gracie mentioned said, when I first moved to the East Village, my rent was $75. And Sir Rodney Sir told me his rent was less than $200. He came probably later. And he said, we did not need to have full-time jobs. We could work for 2 days a week to pay the rent and food
Hmm.
and still have a lot of time to do whatever I want to do. Some people squatted. They never paid any rent
Hmm.
because East Village was a place nobody wanted to be. And that attracted many, many artists because artists need space and they don't have money. Somehow, East Village became a magnet. That's what Paul said, a magnet that attracts more artists. I I just met with this German artist, Rainer Fetting. I asked Rainer, why did you come here? And he said, I heard a lot of stories of East Village, and everybody was telling me I should go there. So he came.
Hmm.
uh, yeah. I mean, I can expound a little bit on the larger issues of gentrification. I don't know how much you want to get into that, and
Yeah.
I'm like a um, uh, amateur economist. I really the issues wrapped up in this are so big, but it really what she said was so true at that time, up and through the 90s. The market forces hadn't, in there was capitalism, there was the Wall Street neighborhood, there was Midtown, there was businesses, um, business districts, but all over New York City there were individual neighborhoods with independent ecosystems and authentic subcultures that were part of a lineage of hundreds of years of turnover and change. But you know, the Germans swept out the Italians, the Puerto Ricans swept out the Irish, but each one of those communities was authentic in a way, and in their own way. And the Lower East Side, because it was the center of immigration of it at that time, um, had had a kind of inherent political insurgent independent spirit. And I think that that was kind of a spiritual foundation for the artists that were then attracted into that community. And because the rents were so cheap, the diversity of artistic experience is so different than what it is today. I mean, you had, you know, Penny was a teen runaway. She came from a working class background. There were Andy Warhol was a working class artist. I mean, there were so many people who came into the city, not through the official channels of art school. You know, there was not a professionalized art world at the time. So that kind of milieu was a more interesting incubator than what we might have today with a more market-oriented art scene and something maybe you could say it's a little more homogenous or it's a little more prescribed because the people go to art school and they study the same influences and they come out of art school replicating those influences, and that applies to all disciplines from painting to poetry to performance. It's a different art world because you need so much money to go to school, and then you need so much money to live your life.
Mm.
So the class distinction is really key, and I think Paul's story, you know, is that perfect sounding board for that whole narrative from the 70s into the present, and you see the changes in the neighborhood, but also as reflected in his own story.
One of the things that I loved, I'm no expert on art, but I can't tell you the number of times I've walked into a small gallery in New York City or wherever, and I just always wondered, like, how does this work financially? Like, maybe there's not many people in there, and there's a limited number of pieces for sale, and they're all super expensive. I know this sounds very naive, but I just was always fascinated with the business model. And it looks like every one of them looks successful because they're always beautiful looking. The artwork is amazing. There's someone there who seems like a real expert and can tell you about why this work is important and whatnot. And if you're someone who's an outsider and you don't really know the whole world, it just gives the illusion of that somehow this is wildly successful financially. Otherwise, it couldn't exist. But at least in this particular story that you're showing, just because a gallery exists and it looks good and there's great art in there, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily making the rent. And you just show that in such an interesting way in this piece. I know it's really about the man, but you do reveal a lot about that aspect. And I was wondering, was that something that you set out to do, or did that story just emerge as the two of you were making the film?
I I did not have any story in mind when we started to make the film. We brought our cameras and started to capture what was going on. I did not know Paul well. I am an outsider from foreign country. I had the same questions that you had. I thought I will see what's going on here.
Hmm.
So the whole story was really put together afterwards. When we were filming, we didn't know what the story was. I learned so much from this experience. So I want to tell the stories, the things I observed, I see. And I had the same question, like you said, right? I walk into a gallery. I didn't know the artists or the art. I see the price and I go, well, why is it so pricey? It must be important. But what makes an artist so important? I have all those questions. So I met with Paul, and Paul does not see art that way. So the film is really about art and the love of art, but we didn't touch too much about the business side, which is something I learned by meeting other art dealers and other experiences, but not my experience with Paul.
Wow. Another interesting part of his story is how he would support artists when they were young, often helping them out either financially or by giving them a place to show their work. And sometimes in return, or very often it seems, they would then give him art, which he became a personal collector of. And in his apartment, which is shown in the film, I mean, there's so much here. He just has this insane art collection. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Paul Paul did not make money out of selling art. He, like Steve said, he came to New York in 1972 at age 18. Very fast, he got a job as a waiter, and he was very good working in restaurants. So he eventually became the maitre d' at the River Cafe, where he made good money at that job. And that's how he funded his first gallery in the East Village. So basically, he, as a gallery owner, he paid the rent, he paid everything that for the gallery. He had this idea. He he used to be a struggled artist. He understands that artists need patrons, and he loves art. He wants to support people he sees talents, people he thinks that are talented. He was still working in restaurants, so he would use those money to buy paintings from artists. So they, like Paul told me, so they can pay their rent, so they can buy food. He did a lot of those kind of things, but not out of selling art, but by working from other jobs he had.
And it's amazing, as you show in the film, that now later on in his life, he found himself in a position where he needed some money to keep the gallery going, and he would have to make a tough choice sometimes to then sell some of these pieces of art. One of the issues that comes up in the film, which was really fascinating, is that, and I guess this is nothing new, but I guess it's becoming increasingly an issue, is that sometimes it's very hard to either authenticate a piece of work by a certain artist, or that I don't really fully understand it. It seems like maybe the real titans in the art industry make it so that uh, you can't sell certain artists because of the fact that you don't have that authentication, and maybe that's done intentionally so that the value of the pieces that are out there go up. Um, Again, this was all very fascinating. Can either of you tell me what you learned about that? From seeing him trying to sell some of his work.
I remember asking Paul how you price an artist. How much does an artwork worth? And he said, as much as you can find a buyer.
Mhm.
So if I walk into a gallery, I see something I like, then I decide if I want to buy it. The second I bought that piece, then the price is set. That's what I learned from Paul. And for the non-name artists, a lot of time when people buy those high-end, quote unquote, expensive art, it's because of the name.
Mhm.
Then people want to make sure it is real from the artist. And when they want to sell it, it is still worth the same amount of money or more. I guess then there's this system, of course, you need to get this piece to be authenticated. So this piece will be in the archives of that artist. And all the foundations have not all, many of the foundations were doing authentication, but they were overwhelmed by the amount of submissions. And it is a hard job. So in this film, we accidentally captured. So that was not a setup. That while we were documenting, we were very often filming at a gallery, or I will tell Paul if something or somebody is coming, something is happening, let us know. We will be there just to see what happens. That was an accident. Somebody reached out to Paul saying that we bought an apartment in Soho. The previous owner died. The apartment was sold as is. We opened the door. There were lots of stuff and many artworks from the 80s. We don't know if this is real, but we want to sell it.
Hmm. That's
And
incredible.
you cannot sell it before it is authenticated.
Right.
And there was the foundation stopped doing it. How do you authenticate it, a piece of art?
Wow. It's a whole other world, and people have tried to figure it out, but very few have. I guess some have, but this movie really explains a lot.
Yeah,
Another,
Tom, I would just add one thing real quickly on that is
yeah,
part of the issue with, I mean, the foundations of the famous artists closing ranks is because there's been a proliferation of fakes.
right, right.
And in the film, the Keith Haring is trying to be authenticated. Certain artists are easier to copy. So, rightly so, the foundations are very, they are trying to preserve the value of what's already in the collection. They're trying to preserve the value of what collectors will pay in the future, so that they have to be very suspect of new things suddenly arising out of nowhere. And so that's, I mean, there's a lot of really good copiers out there
Right.
who are trying to, who are creating things at all levels of the art market and trying to find like a weakness in the system to put this stuff in and to make money.
Steve, I understand that this movie is also important because it really does a great job documenting the AIDS crisis, and sort of telling the history of how it plagued the village and the artists who lived there. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learned in the making of this film about this important time period?
Um, well, I was I was there. I came to New York in '85. Um, I was, witness to what was happening in East Village. The East Village was really being devastated. I read at some point from the early '80s into the '90s, over 25,000 men died just in the East Village. And the activism of ACT UP and other organizations was so present in my consciousness and was such an inspiration to see how people responded in real crisis, real life and death situations in such intelligent and creative ways. And those people were my heroes, and also my theater partner Penny. I mean, she's that typical fag hag who grew up kind of being cast out of her family, raised by gay men. She says she's lost over 300 friends to AIDS. So that's just part of the experience of being in the East Village in the 80s and the 90s. And I think the segment that she edited for this film um, just really captures the tragedy in a very poignant and not overdone way, but a way that was really necessary to be included because um, everyone who was down there, uh, you know, are survivors in a way of that period that was so devastating. Devastating personally, but also the intellectual capital that was an artistic capital that was lost. I mean, many of the greatest artists of that generation disappeared, and uh, and that was kind of like the last nail in the coffin of the East Village,
Mm,
and also the thing that really spurred the hypergentrification with that lineage gone. You know, the new generations. Not, I mean, we definitely support young people coming to New York to create art, but the situation is so different. The landscape is so different, and what they're up against is so different. So you know that new generation, they have to be funded
right.
to to live in the village, and even in parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx now, it's a different world, and AIDS was kind of like a hinge moment.
I've always loved movies that incorporate food and culture and stuff like that in them. I mean, even not that these are anything like this movie, but like Goodfellas or Sopranos or something like that, where they show the people eating and the types of food that they're eating. In this movie, it's very intimate, and there's just so many different scenes where he is drinking red wine or cooking something up in his apartment or having a dinner party, and it's just one of the great parts of the movie. I think people are going to enjoy that. Is that just something that was very important in his life, or did you intentionally just try to bring that aspect of what you were capturing into the film because you like that in movies?
That was something Paul did on a regular basis, the dinner parties. I found that so wonderful. He loved cooking. He worked in restaurants. One thing that's not in the film is Paul's romantic relationships with others, but he had been with people who are super rich. So he understands, the high end wine, cuisines, and everything. But his own life, it's a way of living in poverty, supporting the art world. So has his apartment is full of art. So he loves to cook and invite friends over for dinner so they can talk. There's no TV in his living room, so they talk about art. And the way he sets up, it's as if he is, the way the rich people set up the table. You need this glass, that glass, and that's the way he lives. You don't need a lot of money to have a good life. So it was not because I love to include food in the film. It was what happened in his life, and he does that. And many, many people, he will invite people who he had known for 30 years. He would invite somebody who he met yesterday.
Hmm.
I I've been there in the dinner party. It's always like four people, five the maximum because the table only fits five, and meet people. And I adore him so much because I will ask him like, "Where did you meet Dave?" "Oh, I was in the doctor's waiting room, and he sat next to me, and we were talking."
Yeah. I know we don't have too much more time, but one of the things I loved about him, as you showed in the film, is that even though he was always seeking, I guess, high end people to buy the work, he also had a love for the regular person. And he wanted them to enjoy art too. He makes the comment in the film, this is not his exact words, but he talks about how many people would come into the gallery, and he would know that they're probably not going to be able to afford to buy something, that this was almost like a museum visit for them. But he didn't discourage it, and he would spend time with the people and really tell them the stories of the artists and so forth. And then you even have a little story in the film about him trying to encourage someone to find the money to buy art. This was something that was important to him, wasn't it? Getting regular people to appreciate and value art and find things as well.
That was super important for him, and that was why he opened Smart Clothes Gallery, because the rent had gone up so much. He knew it's very difficult to run a gallery. And like in the film, the landlady, she's also an artist. She said it's very difficult to sell the middle range priced art, because the middle class couldn't find that kind of money for art. Most of the people couldn't find that kind of money for art. And Paul has been in the business for so long. He understands you need the rich people to buy. You need to have the rich to come in and buy to support so the gallery will be sustainable. But his real passion is to talk to people. He loves everybody who comes to the gallery. He just loves to talk. He couldn't stop talking. And he loves telling people stories, the artist, the meaning of the piece of art. And I agree with him because I benefit so much from knowing him and making of the film. Owning a piece of art will change your life in different ways, because everybody will have different piece, and how that affect you will be differently. But owning one piece will change your life. It's the beginning. But how do you convince people who never buy art? So he did what he did, and he believes it, and he believes if he can convince somebody, then that somebody will go out and tell other people, and that's what he did. And I admire him because in the film you can see many people who came to the gallery because the door was always open. So the neighbors will come in to check, not to buy art, but they just came in and check.
Hmm.
And I love that.
Yeah, I love it too, and I love this movie. Gee, Steve, I want to thank you so much for making this movie, coming in on the program. If people want to learn more about your film, is there any place they can go online or on social media?
We don't have any place yet. We do have a website that's www.menfrompretentia.com. We are still in festival circle, so the film is not yet out. But when Kelly from Port Jefferson documentary series reached out, I really, really want to do this because the film is about community, and this is a community screening. But we don't have, it's not yet online.
Well, you do have a website, as you said, and people can go there. And I want people to seek out this film and look for it in festivals because it's one of my favorites this year. Thank you to the both of you, and I wish you the best of luck with the film.
Thank you, Tom.
It was wonderful, Tom. Thanks so much for having us.
Of course. Take it easy.
Cheers.